The men behind the silence, they never sat at the head of the table. No newspaper printed their names in bold. No courtroom sketches captured their faces. And when the stories of organized crime were told about empires, families, and commissions, these men existed only in the margins, shadows behind shadows. But if you trace the real lines of power, you don't stop at the bosses everyone knew. You go further. You find the ones who never needed recognition to rule. In the mythology of the Mafia, power had a structure: bosses, underbosses, consiglières, and above them all, the Commission, the supposed brain of organized crime in America. It was presented as a council, a balance of power meant to prevent chaos. But that narrative? It was clean. Too clean, because real power doesn't sit in meetings. It watches them. Take a step back into the smoke-filled rooms of mid-century America. The bosses gathered, voices low, suits sharp, decisions heavy. Territories were divided, alliances formed, wars avoided or sanctioned. But behind certain decisions, there were patterns, deals that didn't quite make sense, conflicts that ended too neatly, sudden rises of men no one had prepared for. Someone was influencing the board, not loudly, not directly, but consistently. These forgotten bosses weren't always official leaders. Some never held rank at all. They were financiers, fixers, political connectors. The kind of men who understood something fundamental. Control the flow and you control the system. Money. Information. Favors, they didn't command soldiers. They commanded outcomes. One operated through unions, not as a leader, but as a whisperer. Strikes happened when he wanted pressure. They ended when he needed calm. Entire industries moved like chess pieces, and no one could quite prove why. Another built his influence through legitimate fronts: construction, waste management, import businesses. Not glamorous, not headline-worthy. But every shipment, every contract, every delay passed through him. He didn't need to threaten. He simply allowed things to happen, or not. And then there were the diplomats, the men who could walk into any room. Law enforcement, politicians, rival families, and leave with something. Not because they were feared, but because they were trusted, or at least trusted enough. They spoke softly, never overreaching. They made themselves useful, indispensable, even. And over time, they became the quiet axis around which louder men rotated. What made these figures dangerous wasn't brutality, it was invisibility. They weren't targets. They weren't symbols. You couldn't take them down because most people didn't even realize they were up. When crackdowns came, the visible bosses fell. Arrested, exiled, killed. But the system? It adapted. Because the real architects were never in the spotlight to begin with. The truth is, the Mafia didn't just survive because of strength. It survived because of design. A design built not only by the men we remember, but by the ones we don't. And if you look closely enough, you'll start to see it. The same names appearing quietly in different places. The same outcomes repeating under different leaders. Like fingerprints, wiped, but never completely gone. Because power, real power, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It just works in silence. And in that silence, these forgotten men ruled everything. Power doesn't just exist. It's engineered carefully, patiently, and most importantly, quietly. By the time law enforcement began tightening its grip on organized crime, the visible bosses had already made a critical mistake. They believed the structure itself was power, titles, territories, armies, things you could see, things you could target. But the forgotten men? They were already somewhere else entirely. They understood a simple principle. The higher you stand, the easier you fall. So they stayed low, invisible, but everywhere. One of them never owned a single business on paper, not one, yet entire ports moved at his discretion. Cargo disappeared. Containers cleared without inspection. Delays hit competitors with surgical precision. He didn't run the docks. He ran the people who ran the docks: customs officers, shipping managers, union supervisors, each one tied to him through favors, debts, or secrets carefully collected over years. He didn't give orders. He created conditions where the only logical outcome was obedience. Another operated in numbers, not neighborhoods, banks, loans, shell companies. He built a financial web so complex that even those inside it couldn't see the full picture. Money flowed through legitimate channels, washed clean before anyone thought to question it. To the outside world, he was invisible. To the underworld, he was essential, because wars need funding, expansion needs capital. And when the traditional rackets became risky, he was the bridge into something safer, smarter, untouchable. But the most dangerous among them weren't the ones who controlled money or logistics. It was the ones who controlled narrative. There was a man, no official rank, no crew, who had access to information before it became reality. Investigations, indictments, internal conflicts. He knew which boss was under surveillance before the boss himself did. Which alliance was about to fracture. Which rising figure would become a threat. And he used that knowledge not to stop events, but to guide them. A quiet suggestion here, a warning there, a deal timed perfectly. And suddenly, outcomes shifted not dramatically, just enough. That was the pattern, subtle adjustments. Never enough to expose the hand behind them, but always enough to shape the result. The commission thought it was making decisions, but in truth, it was often reacting to pressures it didn't fully understand, pressures designed by men who never needed a seat at the table. And when the government finally struck hard, through surveillance laws, informants, and sweeping prosecutions, the visible hierarchy began to crumble. Bosses went down, families fractured, the structure everyone believed in started to collapse. But behind that collapse, the system kept moving because these shadow figures had already prepared for it. They diversified, reduced exposure, shifted from brute force to influence. They didn't fight the new world. They adapted to it. Legitimate businesses became shields, political connections became armor, information became currency, and violence. That became a last resort, bad for business, bad for visibility. The old mafia was loud, territorial. But what replaced it was something quieter, more precise, more difficult to trace. And at the center of that transformation were the same men who had always understood the truth. You don't need to be seen to be in control. You just need to make sure that everything moves the way you want it to. Because by the time anyone notices the pattern, it's already too late. The decisions have been made, the outcomes locked in, and the real architects? They're already somewhere else, building the next system. Empires fall. That's the part history remembers. The raids, the trials, the headlines declaring the end of something powerful. Organized crime dismantled, the commission broken, the old guard erased. It makes for a clean ending. But reality? It's never that simple. Because what collapsed was only the surface, the structure everyone could see, not the system underneath it. By the late years, the names that once defined the underworld had either disappeared or been reduced to echoes of their former power. Law enforcement celebrated victories. Files were closed. Cases were marked as solved. And for a moment, it looked like control had finally been taken back. But beneath that moment of victory, something quieter was happening. Something familiar. The forgotten bosses didn't fight the end. They absorbed it. They had never been loyal to tradition, only to function. When the old rules became liabilities, they abandoned them. When visibility became dangerous, they erased themselves even further. They didn't cling to titles, ceremonies, or reputations. Those were weaknesses now. And they understood that before anyone else did. The new world didn't need mob bosses. It needed operators. So they became harder to define. No crews. No clear hierarchies. No obvious chains of command. Just networks fluid, adaptive. Difficult to map a businessman here, a consultant there, an investor, a posrednik, a negotiator. On paper, everything looked legitimate, clean, but if you followed the threads, really followed them, you'd start to notice something unsettling, conics that didn't quite add up, decisions that seemed too coordinated, outcomes that favored certain players over and over again. The methods had evolved, but the philosophy? It hadn't changed at all. Control the flow, stay invisible, never become the story. Violence, once the language of power, became inefficient, too loud, too traceable. Instead, influence took its place, regulations bent, not broken. Markets shifted, subtly. Competitors disappeared, not through force, but through pressure no one could quite prove. It was cleaner, and far more effective. And the most unsettling part? There was no longer a clear enemy. You couldn't point to a single family, a single boss, a single organization and say, there it is, because the system wasn't centralized anymore. It didn't need to be. It was embedded. In business, in politics, in systems designed to look legitimate. And the men who once operated in the shadows of the Mafia? They didn't vanish, they transitioned. Not into obscurity, but into permanence. Because when power stops looking like power, it becomes almost impossible to challenge. Today, the stories of organized crime are told like relics of a different era, something dramatic, violent, almost cinematic, but those stories miss the final transformation, the quiet shift from visible control to systemic influence. And the forgotten bosses? They were never forgotten by the only metric that ever mattered: control. They achieved something the old empires never could. A system that doesn't collapse when names are removed. A structure with no single point of failure. A presence that doesn't need recognition to exist. So when people ask where the power went, why it seems quieter now, less obvious, they're asking the wrong question. The power didn't disappear. It just stopped announcing itself. And somewhere, in offices that don't look suspicious, in deals that don't make headlines, in decisions that seem perfectly ordinary, the same kind of men are still there. Not louder, not bigger, but smarter. Watching, adjusting, controlling, just like they always did. Only now, you'll never even know where to look.